Have you ever watched someone's entire world collapse, not from tragedy, but from a single glance? Imagine spending 38 years building fortress walls around your heart, brick by brick, rule by rule, until you've convinced yourself you're untouchable. Then one woman walks through your door, and suddenly, those walls don't just crack. They shatter like glass hitting concrete. This is the story of Wilson Taylor, a billionaire who had one unbreakable rule. A rule so rigid, so absolute, that his entire empire was built around it. No curvy women. Ever. But here's the thing about rules, they were never meant to survive a woman like Viola Anderson. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will make you believe in the impossible power of love to transform even the coldest heart. This story? It's going to wreck you in the most beautiful way possible. Picture this with me. Manhattan. The 47th floor of a gleaming steel tower that pierces the clouds like a shard of frozen ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a city that never sleeps, never stops, never forgives weakness. And in the center of this glass cathedral sat a man who had mastered the art of being untouchable. Wilson Taylor. At first glance, you might think you understand him. Tall, 6 feet 2 inches of controlled power. Broad shoulders that wore a tailored charcoal suit the way a knight wore armor. Clean-shaven jaw sharp enough to cut through excuses. And those eyes? God, those eyes. The color of storm clouds over the Atlantic, gray, piercing, capable of reading your soul while revealing absolutely nothing of his own. But Wilson Taylor wasn't just a billionaire. He was a fortress. A man who had turned self-control into an art form, discipline into religion, and emotional distance into his superpower. His office reflected his soul perfectly. Or rather, the absence of it. Matte black shelves lined with books organized by height and color. A single silver clock on the wall, its mechanical tick-tick-tick the only sound allowed to break the silence. Glass desk so pristine you could perform surgery on it. Not a single personal photo. Not a plant. Not even a coffee stain to suggest humanity existed here. Everything had its place. Everything followed the rules. And Wilson Taylor had rules for everything. The list wasn't written down, it didn't need to be. Everyone who worked at Taylor Tech knew it by heart, whispered about it in hushed tones during lunch breaks, warned newcomers about it on their first day. Rule number 1, never be late. Not even by 60 seconds. Wilson's watch was synchronized with atomic precision, and he expected the same from everyone else. Time, he believed, was the ultimate test of respect. Rule number 2, no small talk. Ever. Weather? Don't care. Weekend plans? Irrelevant. Your kid's soccer game? Save it for someone who doesn't have a company to run. Get to the point, state the facts, and get out. Efficiency over empathy. Always. Rule number 3, no bright colors in his presence. Black, white, gray, navy, the colors of control, of professionalism, of emotional neutrality. Someone once wore a red tie to a meeting. Once. They learned quickly that in Wilson's world, color was chaos. But the fourth rule? The fourth rule was the foundation upon which all others were built. The unspoken commandment that governed not just his office, but his entire existence. Absolutely, under no circumstances, no exceptions, no curvy women. Not as employees. Not as business partners. Not as dates. Not in his orbit at all. And before you judge him, before you write him off as shallow or cruel, you need to understand where this rule came from. Because Wilson Taylor wasn't born cold. He was made that way. Her name was Catherine Taylor. Once upon a time, she had been royalty in the fashion world, editor-in-chief of Vogue's European edition, a position of such power that designers would weep at her critiques and celebrities would beg for her approval. Catherine Taylor moved through the world like a scalpel, precise, sharp, cutting away anything that didn't meet her impossible standards of perfection. She had cheekbones that could slice paper and opinions that could destroy careers. Her closet contained nothing but black, white, and the occasional slash of blood red. Her apartment looked like a museum, beautiful, untouchable, cold. And she raised her son the same way she edited a magazine, with ruthless precision and zero tolerance for anything outside the narrow definition of acceptable. Wilson grew up measuring his worth by the approval in his mother's eyes, or more often, the disappointment that flickered there when he fell short of her impossible standards. Wilson, darling, she would say, her voice dripping with that particular brand of upper-class disdain, control your body or it will control you. The world respects discipline, not indulgence. When he was 16, Wilson made the mistake of bringing home his first girlfriend. Her name was Rachel. Sweet, bubbly Rachel with curves that filled out her sundress and a laugh that was too loud for Catherine's refined sensibilities. She wore yellow, bright, joyful, unapologetic yellow, and she had the audacity to hug Wilson in front of his mother. Catherine took one look at her and pulled Wilson aside. That girl, she hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his arm, represents everything you need to avoid if you want to be great. She's chaos in human form. Soft. Undisciplined. Emotional. She'll distract you from your goals, make you weak, turn you into someone ordinary. Catherine's eyes went cold. You want to build an empire? You don't have time for that. Rachel was gone within a week. And from that moment forward, Wilson learned to date women who fit his mother's approval, tall, slender, controlled. Women who looked stunning on his arm at charity galas but never made his pulse race. Women who were beautiful in the way a marble statue is beautiful, perfect, cold, and ultimately, lifeless. Because curvy women, women with soft edges and warm laughs and emotions that bubbled too close to the surface, they represented everything Catherine had taught him to fear. Softness was weakness. Curves were chaos. Emotion was the enemy of excellence. So Wilson Taylor built his life, his company, and his heart around this one central truth: control everything, feel nothing, and never, ever, let anyone who might make him feel something get close enough to matter. For 20 years, this strategy worked perfectly. Until it didn't. It was a Tuesday morning in late September. 10:47 a.m., to be precise. Wilson sat at his glass desk, reviewing quarterly earnings reports with the kind of laser focus that would make a brain surgeon jealous. The numbers were good, better than good. Taylor Tech had just closed its most profitable quarter in company history. Everything was going according to plan. His assistant, Cheryl, a sharp-tongued woman in her 50s who'd been with him for 12 years and took absolutely no nonsense from anyone, buzzed through on the intercom. Your 11 a.m. interview is here, Mr. Taylor. Wilson didn't look up from his tablet. Resume summary? Exceptional doesn't even begin to cover it. Harvard MBA with honors. Fluent in French, Mandarin, and Spanish. 6 years with Thornton Global in their international operations division. Led a team that increased market penetration in Asia by 47%. Her references read like a love letter. Honestly? She's overqualified for an executive assistant position. Good, Wilson replied, his tone flat. Send her in. Let's not waste time. He expected another perfectly acceptable candidate who would blend seamlessly into his ecosystem. Another professional who understood that in his world, excellence was the baseline and emotion was checked at the door. What he got was Viola Anderson. And nothing would ever be the same again. The door opened. And I need you to understand, the air in that room didn't just shift. It transformed. She didn't walk into that office. She arrived. Like the first sunlight breaking through storm clouds after days of rain. Like the first breath of spring after an endless winter. Like hope taking physical form and daring you to look away. Viola Anderson moved with a confidence that doesn't need to announce itself because it simply is. It wasn't arrogance. Arrogance is loud, desperate for attention. This was something else entirely. This was a woman who knew her worth down to her bones and didn't need anyone's permission to take up space in the world. Her mocha skin seemed to glow under the harsh morning light pouring through those floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore a light lavender dress, not bright enough to break Wilson's color rule, but soft enough to stand out in his monochrome world. The dress was modest by anyone's standards, professional, appropriate for an interview at a Fortune 500 company. But here's the thing about Viola Anderson. She had curves. Beautiful, unapologetic, impossible to ignore curves that the dress hugged in a way that was both completely professional and absolutely, devastatingly distracting. And Wilson Taylor, the man who had trained his brain to dismiss exactly this type of woman, who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of looking past anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable, felt something crack inside his chest. Not break. Not yet. But crack. Like ice on a frozen lake when the temperature starts to rise. Viola extended her hand with a smile that didn't seek his approval. It offered it. As if she was doing him the favor by being there. Mr. Taylor, her voice was warm honey over gravel, confident and melodic all at once. It's a pleasure to meet you. Wilson stood, 6 years of expensive etiquette training kicking in automatically, and hesitated for a fraction too long before taking her hand. The moment their skin touched, something electric shot up his arm. Her handshake was warm, firm, grounded, the handshake of someone who knows exactly who they are and makes no apologies for it. He pulled his hand back too quickly, as if burned. Miss Anderson, he managed, his voice more clipped than usual. He motioned toward the chair across from his desk. Let's begin. As she sat, Wilson tried desperately to maintain his composure, to slip back into the cold professionalism that had served him so well for so long. He failed. Because he couldn't help but notice the effortless way she carried herself, confident without arrogance, poised without pretension. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, her makeup subtle but flawless. Small gold earrings caught the light. Everything about her presentation was professional, appropriate, perfectly suited for a corporate interview. And yet somehow, she filled the entire room with her presence. He tried not to stare. He failed at that too. Viola noticed, of course. How could she not? But she didn't acknowledge it, didn't let it show on her face. She simply sat there, hands folded gracefully in her lap, waiting for him to begin the interview with a small, knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips. Wilson cleared his throat and forced himself to focus on the resume in front of him, flipping through the pages like a robot trying to distract itself from a system malfunction. "Your resume is solid," he said, the word solid feeling inadequate the moment it left his mouth. "Harvard MBA, impressive corporate experience, multilingual capabilities. But I have to ask, why would someone with your credentials want to leave a position like yours to apply here as an executive assistant? That's a significant step backward." Viola met his gaze without blinking, without hesitation, without a trace of defensiveness. "Because I want to observe a different kind of leadership," she replied simply. "One where excellence isn't just requested, it's expected. Where standards aren't negotiable and mediocrity isn't tolerated. Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Taylor. You've built something remarkable here, and I want to learn from someone who doesn't apologize for demanding the best." Wilson leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. That answer was both flattering and strategic. Intelligent. Well-crafted. She'd clearly done her research, understood his management philosophy, and knew exactly how to position herself. He hated how much he liked it. "And what makes you believe you can thrive under my expectations?" he asked, choosing his words carefully. "I don't tolerate mistakes. I don't accept excuses. I expect perfection as a baseline, not as an aspiration." The small smile on Viola's lips widened just slightly. "Because I don't break under pressure, Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I break pressure apart." For the first time in years, maybe decades, Wilson Taylor smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, the tiniest crack in his carefully maintained facade. But it was there. Real. Genuine. And in that moment, he knew. He knew she was different. He knew she was dangerous. He knew he was going to hire her anyway. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, a professional back and forth about systems management, calendar optimization, communication protocols, crisis handling. Viola answered every question with the perfect balance of confidence and competence, demonstrating a level of preparedness that impressed even Wilson. When she finally stood to leave, extending her hand once more for a farewell handshake, Wilson took it without hesitation this time. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Taylor," she said. "We'll be in touch, Miss Anderson," he replied, his voice betraying nothing. But as the door closed behind her, Wilson remained standing, staring at the space where she'd been, feeling like someone had just rearranged all the furniture in his mind while he wasn't looking. Several minutes passed in silence. Then Cheryl re-entered, her eyebrows raised in that knowing way of hers, the way that said she'd seen everything through the glass walls and was forming opinions she'd definitely share whether he wanted to hear them or not. "Well," she prompted. Wilson adjusted his cuffs, a nervous habit he'd developed in childhood and never quite shaken. "She's different." Different good, or different potential HR nightmare? Wilson turned to face his assistant fully, his expression unreadable. "Hire her." Cheryl blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Hire her," he repeated, more firmly this time. 2-week trial basis. If she doesn't fit, she's out. But I want her to start Monday. Wilson. Cheryl's voice took on that warning tone, the one she only used when she thought he was making a mistake. "That woman has." "I'm aware of what that woman has," Wilson interrupted coldly. "She also has an Harvard MBA, 6 years of relevant experience, and the kind of strategic intelligence we need in this office. This is a business decision based on qualifications. Nothing more." Cheryl studied him for a long moment, her expression skeptical. "If you say so," she finally replied. "I'll make the call." As she left, Wilson returned to his desk, trying to focus on the earnings report still pulled up on his tablet. But his mind kept drifting back to soft lavender fabric, warm honey voice, and a handshake that had felt like touching a live wire. He already knew the truth, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. Viola Anderson wasn't the one who might not fit into his world. He was the one whose world was about to be completely rewritten. And deep down, in a place he didn't dare examine too closely, he didn't hate it. The first week was torture disguised as perfection. Viola was flawless. Not in a robotic, soulless way. Wilson had plenty of employees who could execute tasks perfectly while remaining completely forgettable. No, Viola was flawless in the way she made excellence seem effortless, natural, as inevitable as breathing. Every calendar invite arrived 10 minutes before Wilson needed it. Every file was color-coded and tabbed in ways he didn't even know he needed but immediately couldn't imagine living without. She'd somehow figured out that the harsh lighting in his office was causing his afternoon headaches and adjusted it without being asked. The headaches disappeared. She started keeping mint tea stocked in the executive lounge, not the cheap stuff from the office supply catalog, but real loose-leaf Moroccan mint tea from a boutique shop in Brooklyn. The first time Wilson found a cup waiting for him after a particularly brutal board meeting, something in his chest tightened. His late grandmother used to make him mint tea exactly like this when he was a child, back before Catherine had trained all the softness out of him. How could Viola possibly know that? He didn't ask. He was afraid of the answer. But he found himself looking forward to her morning briefings with an anticipation that felt dangerous. Found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the way she tucked a loose curl behind her ear when she was concentrating, the way she laughed at Cheryl's dry humor, the way she commanded a room full of senior executives without ever raising her voice. It wasn't just attraction, though God knows there was plenty of that. Every time she leaned over his desk to point out something in a report, her perfume, something subtle, like jasmine and sandalwood, made his brain short-circuit. Every time she brushed past him in the hallway, her shoulder barely grazing his arm, he felt it like an electric shock. But it was more than physical. Viola challenged his comfort zone by simply existing in it. She didn't apologize for her body, her background, or her brilliance. She took up space unapologetically. She had opinions, strong ones, and she wasn't afraid to share them, even when they contradicted his. She laughed fully, worked intensely, and lived loudly in a way that made Wilson's carefully controlled existence feel small and suffocating by comparison. She was disruption in human form. And Wilson Taylor, master of control, was losing his grip. One afternoon, after a strategy meeting that had gone surprisingly well thanks to Viola's last-minute research, Wilson found himself walking beside her down the hallway. Not ahead of her, as he typically walked ahead of everyone. Beside her. As equals. You handled that investor objection well, he heard himself say, the compliment surprising them both. Viola glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. Thank you. I figured you were about to tell him off, but that wouldn't be your brand, so I stepped in. Wilson tilted his head slightly. You figured out my brand already? You've been here less than a week. I read people fast, she replied simply. And your brand is power with polish. Controlled, never chaotic. You want people to respect you, not fear you, even though you're perfectly capable of being feared when necessary. He stopped walking, genuinely surprised by her assessment. And you? What's your brand? She turned to face him fully, those warm brown eyes meeting his gray ones without hesitation. Fire wrapped in silk, she said. Wilson stared at her for a beat too long, his body catching up before his brain did, heart rate increasing, pupils dilating, breath becoming shallow. All the physiological responses he'd trained himself to suppress were screaming at him now. This woman was dangerous. This woman was going to destroy everything he'd built. This woman was perfect. He cleared his throat and turned away abruptly, continuing down the hallway as if that conversation hadn't just rearranged something fundamental in his chest. By the second week, the entire office was buzzing. People noticed things. They always did in corporate environments where gossip was the primary currency. They noticed that Wilson Taylor, the man famous for his emotional distance, his ice-cold demeanor, his complete lack of interest in anything that didn't directly impact quarterly earnings, seemed different. Less icy. More human. His gaze lingered longer when Viola spoke during meetings. He asked for her opinion on matters no executive assistant would typically weigh in on. He smiled more, actually smiled, something many junior employees had never witnessed before. And of course, whispers followed. Did you see the way he looks at her? She's only been here 2 weeks and she's already running half his schedule. Someone's going to HR. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. I give it a month before he either fires her or does something really stupid. Some called it a ticking time bomb. Others bet on how long it would take before the inevitable explosion. Cheryl, ever the voice of blunt truth, finally voiced what everyone was thinking during a closed-door meeting at the end of the second Friday. You like her, she said plainly, not bothering with preamble or politeness. Wilson didn't look up from his laptop. She's efficient. She's also curvy, Cheryl continued, her tone leaving no room for denial, which you've made a reputation avoiding like the plague for your entire adult life. So either you're going to change that rule, or you're going to fire her before you make a complete fool of yourself. Your choice. Wilson snapped his laptop shut with more force than necessary. She's here because she's good at her job. Period. Wilson. Cheryl's voice softened, something she rarely did. Just be honest with yourself. That woman isn't just under your skin. She's rewriting it. He had no response to that. Because she was right. That evening, long after most of the office had cleared out, Viola knocked softly on his office door. She stood in the doorway with her coat draped over her arm, professional as always, but with something softer in her expression. "You forgot to sign off on the Macmillan proposal," she said, holding out a manila folder. Wilson took it, letting their fingers brush for a moment too long. The folder felt heavier than it should, weighted with unspoken words and suppressed feelings. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual, rougher around the edges. Viola tilted her head, studying him with those perceptive eyes that always seemed to see too much. "You look like a man fighting a civil war inside himself," she said softly. Wilson blinked, caught completely off guard. What? "I've seen it before," she added, taking a small step back toward the door. "The war between who you think you should be and who you actually are. It's exhausting, isn't it? Pretending all the time." She paused in the doorway, her silhouette backlit by the hallway lights. "Just don't let your fear win, Mr. Taylor." And then she was gone, leaving Wilson alone in his glass office with a folder he could barely focus on, a silence that felt oppressive rather than peaceful, and a sudden, terrifying realization blooming in his chest. He didn't want her to leave. Not just the office. Not just his life. He didn't want her to leave at all. Wilson didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, a space that cost more per month than most people earned in a year, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The city glittered below like a restless ocean of light, millions of lives unfolding in those glowing windows, millions of stories being written while he sat alone in his glass tower. A glass of 18-year-old scotch sat untouched on the side table. Usually, whiskey helped him think, helped him plan, helped him maintain the distance necessary to make difficult decisions. Tonight, it just sat there mocking him. Because he couldn't stop hearing Viola's voice echoing in his head. "Just don't let your fear win." What fear? He wasn't afraid of anyone. He was Wilson Taylor, controlled, composed, untouchable. He'd built a billion-dollar company through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. He'd outmaneuvered competitors who tried to destroy him, navigated economic downturns that bankrupted others, fired people without flinching when they failed to meet his standards. Fear wasn't part of his vocabulary. Except that was a lie, wasn't it? The truth gnawed at him like a hidden wound that wouldn't heal, painful, persistent, impossible to ignore no matter how hard he tried. He was afraid. Terrified, actually. Not of Viola Anderson herself. But of what she made him feel. Of what she represented. Of the way she'd walked into his carefully controlled world and exposed it for what it truly was, not strength, but a prison of his own making. She made him want things he'd convinced himself he didn't need. Made him feel things he'd trained himself to suppress. Made him question every rule, every boundary, every wall he'd built over 20 years of emotional self-discipline. Viola Anderson had become the exception to every rule he lived by. And it absolutely terrified him. The next morning, she arrived early as always, 7:15 a.m., a full 45 minutes before anyone else in the executive suite. She wore a soft blush-toned blouse and high-waisted charcoal skirt that hugged her curves in a way that was completely professional and utterly distracting. Her hair was down today, natural curls framing her face like a crown. She greeted him with her usual confident warmth, eyes bright, voice smooth like honey over warm tea. "Good morning, Mr. Taylor. Your 8:30 with the board has been moved up to 8 o'clock. Jenkins called in sick, so I've briefed Martinez to present the quarterly figures instead. And I had your usual breakfast delivered, Greek yogurt with honey and granola, 2 black coffees, and I added a croissant because you skipped dinner last night." Wilson stared at her, caught off guard. "How did you? You always leave late when you skip dinner," she said simply, setting the brown paper bag on his desk with a small smile. "The security logs are time-stamped. It's not difficult to notice patterns." She was taking care of him. Anticipating his needs. Reading his habits. Paying attention in a way no one had in, he couldn't remember how long. It made his chest ache in a way he didn't have words for. "Thank you, Miss Anderson," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. She nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Mr. Taylor? Try to eat the croissant. You'll need the energy today." And then she was gone, leaving Wilson staring at a brown paper bag like it held the secrets of the universe. By midweek, crisis struck. A major client's project had gone catastrophically wrong. The vendor they'd relied on for a critical component had failed to deliver, and the product launch Wilson had personally promised investors was now on the verge of complete collapse. The boardroom was chaos, executives shouting over each other, blame being thrown around like grenades, panic spreading like wildfire. Wilson sat at the head of the table, jaw clenched so tight it ached, hands gripping the armrests of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. He could feel the walls closing in. Feel the weight of expectation crushing down on his chest. Feel control slipping through his fingers like water, and control was the only thing that had ever kept him safe. Midway through the meeting, he stood abruptly and walked out. He found himself in the executive lounge, alone, rubbing the bridge of his nose and trying desperately to breathe through the tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the failed project and everything to do with feeling like he was drowning while everyone watched. Too much caffeine? Wilson's eyes snapped open. Viola stood a few feet away, holding a bottle of water with that calm, knowing expression on her face. He started, but couldn't finish. She stepped closer, setting the water on the counter beside him. Try breathing instead, she said softly. In through the nose, hold it, out through the mouth. Slow. Steady. Like this. She demonstrated, her chest rising and falling with deliberate, measured breaths. Wilson stared at her like she'd just suggested he sprout wings and fly. Trust me, she said, meeting his eyes. Just try. And because he was desperate, because he was drowning, because she was looking at him with something in her eyes that felt like understanding rather than judgment. He tried. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. Again. And again. And slowly, impossibly, the vice around his chest loosened. You always walk into a room like you own it, he said suddenly, his voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Like nothing can shake you. How? Viola raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment or a critique? A compliment, he replied immediately. And a question. How do you do that? Stay calm when everything's falling apart? She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Because I learned a long time ago that control is an illusion, she said finally. You can't control the world, Mr. Taylor. You can't control other people. You can barely control yourself, no matter how hard you try. The only thing you can control is how you respond. And panic? Panic helps nothing. Wilson felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it could thaw. I'm not good at this, he admitted quietly. At feeling things. I know, Viola said, her voice gentle. But you're trying. That counts for something. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, the chaos of the building faded away, the shouting boardroom, the failed project, the weight of expectations. There was just her warm brown eyes and his stormy gray ones, and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be ice anymore. Then someone cleared their throat behind them. Cheryl stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression knowing. Board meeting resumed in 5, she said, then added with a slight smirk, both of you might want to, compose yourselves before heading back. Viola stepped back smoothly, professional mask sliding back into place. Thank you, Cheryl. Mr. Taylor, I'll see you back in the boardroom. And just like that, the moment shattered. But the crack in Wilson's armor remained, growing wider with every passing day. 3 weeks after Viola started, Wilson made the mistake that would change everything. He kissed her. It wasn't planned. It wasn't strategic. It was the exact opposite of everything Wilson Taylor prided himself on being. It happened late on a Friday evening. Most of the office had cleared out hours ago, but Wilson and Viola were still there, working on a presentation for Monday's investor meeting. They'd ordered Thai food, her suggestion, his reluctant agreement, and eaten it straight from the containers while arguing about slide design. This graph is cluttered, Viola said, pointing at his laptop screen. You're trying to show too much information at once. Simplify. It needs to be comprehensive, Wilson countered. Investors want data, not pretty pictures. Investors want clarity, she shot back. Data without context is just noise. Trust me on this. They went back and forth like that for 20 minutes, and somewhere in the middle of the argument, Wilson realized he was smiling. Actually smiling. Like this was fun. When had work become fun? Viola must have noticed, because she paused mid-sentence, tilting her head with that knowing look. What? She asked. You challenge me, Wilson said, the words coming out before he could stop them. No one challenges me anymore. They either agree with everything I say or they're too afraid to speak up. But you don't back down. Would you respect me if I did? She asked softly. No, he admitted. I wouldn't. Then there's your answer. They stood there in the dim office, lit only by his desk lamp and the glow of the city outside the windows. Viola's hair had fallen loose from its bun hours ago, curls framing her face. She had a small smudge of Thai sauce on her cheek that she hadn't noticed. Without thinking, Wilson reached out and wiped it away with his thumb. The moment his skin touched hers, everything stopped. Viola's breath caught. Her eyes went wide. Wilson's hand lingered against her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. Wilson, she whispered, the first time she'd ever used his first name. And that was it. That whisper of his name destroyed the last of his control. He kissed her. Not tentatively, not carefully, but with all the desperate longing he'd been suppressing for 3 weeks. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer. She melted into him, her fingers gripping his shirt like she was drowning and he was air. It was fire and ice colliding. It was every rule he'd ever made shattering into a million pieces. It was terrifying and perfect and completely, utterly insane. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, reality crashed back in like a tidal wave. "Oh God," Wilson breathed, taking a step back, running his hand through his hair. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "Don't," Viola said firmly, cutting him off. "Don't you dare apologize for that. But I'm your boss. This is completely inappropriate. I crossed a line." "Wilson." She said his name again, and the sound of it made his heart stutter. "Stop. Just stop." He stared at her, chest heaving, mind racing. "This can't happen," he said, even though every cell in his body was screaming the opposite. "I have rules. Standards. A reputation to maintain. If anyone found out?" "Found out what?" Viola challenged, taking a step toward him. "That you're human? That you're capable of feeling something real instead of just controlling everything around you? That would be so terrible?" "You don't understand," Wilson said desperately. "My whole life is built on control. Without it, everything falls apart. I fall apart." "You're already falling apart," Viola said softly. "You've been falling apart since the day I walked in here. The only question is whether you're brave enough to let yourself land." The words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. God help him, she was right. He was falling apart. Had been for weeks. And no amount of rules or discipline or emotional distance was going to change that. "I'm afraid," he admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep and vulnerable and true. "I'm afraid that if I let myself feel you, I won't be able to go back. Won't be able to control it. Won't be able to stop." Viola moved closer until they were inches apart, her eyes soft but unwavering. "Then don't stop," she whispered. And she kissed him this time. Slower. Deeper. With a tenderness that broke something in his chest and rebuilt it stronger. When they finally pulled apart, Wilson rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his hands trembling slightly where they held her waist. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to be this." "Neither do I," Viola admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we figure it out together." For a long moment, they just stood there, breathing each other in, letting the magnitude of what had just happened settle over them like snow. Then reality intruded again. Cheryl's voice crackled through the intercom. She'd apparently stayed late too, ever vigilant. "Wilson, you have an early meeting tomorrow. Suggest you both head home and get some sleep. Separately." They jumped apart like guilty teenagers. Viola laughed, actually laughed, at the ridiculousness of it all. And despite everything, despite his fear and his rules and his carefully maintained control, Wilson laughed too. It was the sound of something breaking. And something beginning. The weekend that followed was torture. Wilson spent Saturday and Sunday alone in his penthouse, pacing like a caged animal, his mind spinning through every possible scenario, every potential consequence, every reason why pursuing anything with Viola Anderson was professional suicide. She was his employee. His direct report. The power dynamic alone was problematic enough to get him sued into oblivion if things went wrong. The company had a strict fraternization policy. He'd helped write it. His mother would lose her mind. Not that Catherine's opinion should matter anymore, she'd been dead for 5 years, but her voice still echoed in his head, whispering poison, soft. Undisciplined. She'll ruin you, And yet he couldn't stop thinking about the way Viola felt in his arms. The way she challenged him. The way she made him laugh. The way she looked at him like he was more than just a collection of achievements and standards and cold perfection. She looked at him like he was human. Like he was worthy of being loved. Monday morning came too fast and not fast enough. Wilson arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., earlier than usual, needing the extra time to compose himself. He'd rehearsed a speech over the weekend, professional, clear, establishing boundaries while acknowledging what had happened. Viola arrived at 7:15, as always. She knocked softly on his door, and Wilson's heart rate immediately spiked. "Come in," he called, standing behind his desk like it was a shield. She entered, and his carefully prepared speech dissolved instantly. She looked beautiful, not that she didn't always, but today there was something different in her expression. Less guarded. More open. Like she'd made a decision over the weekend too. "We need to talk," they both said simultaneously. Despite the tension, they both smiled. "You first," Viola said, settling into the chair across from his desk with that infuriating grace. Wilson took a breath, trying to remember his planned words. What happened Friday was inevitable, Viola finished. He blinked. That's not what I was going to say. But it's true, she continued calmly. Wilson, I'm not naive. I know the professional implications. I know the risks. I know this could blow up in both our faces. Then why? Because some things are worth the risk, she said simply. And I think you might be one of them. Wilson felt something in his chest expand painfully, like a muscle that had atrophied from disuse suddenly being asked to work again. I have rules, he said weakly. Standards. A way of doing things that has worked for 20 years. And has it made you happy? Viola asked gently. This life you've built, these walls you've created, has it actually made you happy? The question hung in the air like smoke. Had it made him happy? He'd been successful. Wealthy. Respected. In control. But happy? When was the last time he'd laughed before Viola? When was the last time he'd looked forward to Monday? When was the last time he'd felt anything besides cold satisfaction at meeting another goal? He couldn't remember. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know how to be with someone. How to be open. How to feel things without it destroying my ability to function. Viola stood and walked around his desk, a bold move, entering his personal space uninvited. She placed her hand gently on his cheek, and Wilson's eyes closed involuntarily at the touch. Then learn, she whispered. Learn with me. Not perfectly. Not according to some plan or set of rules. Just learn. When his eyes opened, they were glassy with unshed tears, something no one had seen from Wilson Taylor since he was a child. What if I fail? He asked. What if I'm not capable of being what you need? Then we'll figure it out, Viola said. Together. But Wilson, you have to choose. You can't keep one foot in the fortress and one foot outside. You have to decide what matters more, protecting yourself or living. She stepped back, giving him space. I'm going to be in my office. When you decide, come find me. But know this, I'm not going to spend my life waiting for you to be brave enough to want me. So decide soon. And then she left, leaving Wilson alone with the weight of the most important choice he'd ever make. Wilson sat at his desk for exactly 47 minutes. Staring at nothing. Thinking about everything. His entire life had been built on careful calculation. Risk assessment. Controlling variables. Eliminating uncertainty. But Viola was uncertainty incarnate. There were no guarantees. No safety nets. No way to predict or control how this would end. She could hurt him. She probably would hurt him, because everyone did eventually. She could ruin his reputation, his career, everything he'd built. She could make him soft, vulnerable, weak, all the things Catherine had trained him to fear. Or she could make him happy. Actually, genuinely, bone-deep happy in a way he'd never experienced before. At minute 48, Wilson made his decision. He stood, straightened his tie out of habit, took a breath, and walked out of his office. Cheryl looked up from her desk, eyebrows raised. Wilson. Hold all my calls, he said. For how long? Indefinitely. He walked past her before she could respond, his stride purposeful, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Viola's assistant looked startled when Wilson appeared at her door. Mr. Taylor, Is she in? Yes, but. Wilson didn't wait for permission. He opened the door and walked in. Viola was standing at her window, looking out at the city, her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that tried for casual but betrayed tension in every line. She turned when she heard him enter, and the look on her face, hope mixed with caution, nearly broke him. I'm terrified, Wilson said without preamble. Viola blinked. Okay. I'm terrified, he repeated, moving closer, because I've never wanted anything the way I want this. Want you. And that level of want, it's dangerous. It makes me vulnerable. It goes against every rule I've lived by. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. But I'm more terrified of the alternative, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. Of letting you walk away because I was too afraid to be brave. Of spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been if I'd just had the courage to try. Tears welled in Viola's eyes. I can't promise I'll be good at this, Wilson said. I can't promise I won't mess it up or revert to old habits or struggle with letting my guard down. But I can promise I'll try. Every day, I'll try. He took a final step forward, closing the distance between them. I choose you, he whispered. I choose this. I choose being brave enough to live instead of just existing. If you'll still have me. A single tear rolled down Viola's cheek, and she smiled, that beautiful, radiant smile that had destroyed his defenses from day one. I'll have you, she whispered back. And when they kissed this time, it wasn't desperate or stolen or tinged with guilt. It was a promise. A beginning. A leap into the terrifying, exhilarating unknown. Together. But of course, the real world had other plans. 3 days later, Viola handed in her resignation. Wilson stared at the envelope on his desk like it was a bomb. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A resignation letter," Viola said calmly. "Effective in 2 weeks." "No." "Wilson." "No," he repeated, standing abruptly. "You can't quit. I won't accept it." "You don't have a choice," she said gently. It can't exist while I work for you. The power dynamic is too problematic. And I refuse to let our relationship put you or this company at risk." "So what, you're just going to leave? Walk away from a career opportunity because we kissed?" "I'm leaving so we can be together properly," Viola corrected. "Without ethical conflicts. Without whispers. Without me being the assistant the boss is sleeping with." Wilson's jaw clenched. "I'll change the policy. I'll recuse myself from your performance reviews. It's not enough," Viola interrupted. "And you know it. As long as I report to you, directly or indirectly, there will always be questions. Always doubt. Always the assumption that I didn't earn my place." She moved closer, taking his hand. "I'm not giving you up," she said softly. "I'm giving up the job so I can have you without compromise. There's a difference." Wilson felt something crack in his chest, but this time it wasn't painful. It was the final piece of his armor falling away, revealing the soft, vulnerable human underneath. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Probably not," Viola agreed with a small smile. "But you're stuck with me anyway." 2 weeks later, Viola's last day arrived. The office threw her a small goodbye party, cake in the conference room, generic well wishes, the usual corporate farewell ritual. But when everyone else had left, Wilson found her in her now empty office, packing the last of her things into a box. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She looked up, and the smile on her face was pure sunshine. "Almost. There's one more thing I need to do." She walked over to him, took his face in both her hands, and kissed him. Not hidden, not careful, not worried about who might see. Just a kiss. Full of promise and hope and the terrifying joy of new beginnings. When they pulled apart, both breathless, Viola whispered, "Now I'm ready." The weeks that followed Viola's resignation were the strangest and most wonderful of Wilson's life. For the first time in 2 decades, he had a life outside the office. They started slowly, dinner dates where they talked until the restaurant staff politely suggested they leave. Long walks through Central Park where Wilson learned to appreciate autumn leaves and Viola's hand in his. Weekend trips to her favorite bookstore in Brooklyn where she introduced him to poetry he'd never had time to read. Viola was patient with his struggles. When he reverted to being emotionally distant, she called him on it gently. When he tried to control everything, where they ate, what they did, how they spent their time, she pushed back with humor and grace. "Wilson, I love you," she said one evening when he'd spent 20 minutes debating restaurant options like it was a corporate merger, "but you need to learn that sometimes, wherever you want, is an acceptable answer." He stared at her. "You love me?" She smiled. "Did I stutter? But I'm difficult. Controlling. Emotionally stunted. You're also brilliant, loyal, surprisingly funny when you let yourself be, and trying so hard to change that it makes my heart hurt," Viola interrupted. "So yes, Wilson Taylor. I love you. Even with all your glorious dysfunction." Wilson felt tears prick his eyes, something that was becoming dangerously common around her. "I love you too," he whispered, the words foreign but true. "God help me, I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good," Viola said, pulling him into a hug. "You should be terrified. Love is terrifying. But it's also the only thing worth being terrified of." 8 weeks after Viola left Taylor Tech, Wilson made a decision that shocked everyone, including himself. He promoted Cheryl to interim CEO and took a month-long leave of absence. "What are you doing?" his board demanded during the emergency meeting he called. "Learning to live," Wilson replied simply. And he did. He took Viola to his family's beach house in the Hamptons, a place he'd inherited from his father but never visited because it held too many memories of a childhood before Catherine had hardened him. They spent a month there, away from the city, away from expectations, away from the persona Wilson Taylor had worn like armor for so long. They cooked together, badly, walked the beach at dawn, watched old movies, talked until the early hours about everything and nothing. Viola met the man underneath the billionaire, the one who secretly loved terrible puns, who cried during sad movies, who was terrified of spiders but pretended not to be, who dreamed of having a family but had never believed he deserved one. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the Atlantic, Wilson turned to her with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For seeing past all the walls. For teaching me that control isn't strength, vulnerability is." Viola took his hand, intertwining their fingers. You did the hard part, Wilson. You chose to let me in. That took more courage than anything else. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. I built a world where everything had to fit inside boxes, he said. Perfect shapes, perfect faces, controlled lives, because I thought control meant safety. He paused, emotion thick in his throat. Then you walked in. You weren't what I expected. You weren't what I allowed myself to want. But you were everything I needed to see. They sat in silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, two people who had found each other against all odds, against all rules, against all reason. And for the first time in his life, Wilson Taylor felt truly, completely at peace. 2 months later, Wilson made another shocking announcement. Viola Anderson was joining Taylor Tech. Not as his assistant. As vice president of operations. She'd earned it, proven her worth through interviews with the board, presentations that left even the skeptical executives impressed, recommendations from her previous employer that read like love letters. There were still whispers, of course. Office gossip never completely dies. But Viola silenced them quickly with sheer competence. She transformed the company's culture, implementing diversity initiatives that actually worked, launching mentorship programs that changed lives, creating an environment where excellence was expected but humanity was honored. For the first time in its history, Taylor Tech was voted best place to work in New York City. Wilson watched her command boardrooms with the same passion she'd used to challenge him from day one, and he never stopped being in awe of her. They were careful to maintain professional boundaries at work. No public displays of affection, no special treatment, no reason for anyone to question her qualifications. But after hours? After hours, they built a life together. They traveled, Paris, Tokyo, Santorini, everywhere Viola had dreamed of going and Wilson had been too busy to visit. They built a lakeside house upstate, a refuge from the city where they could breathe. They adopted a rescue dog named Gatsby who had anxiety issues and was afraid of thunderstorms, and Wilson, the man who'd never had so much as a goldfish, became the most devoted dog dad imaginable. Sunday mornings were for pancakes and jazz. Friday nights were for wine and stargazing on the balcony. Random Tuesdays were for dancing in the kitchen while dinner burned on the stove. They were building something bigger than a love story. They were building a life. And then, one rainy afternoon in April, everything changed again. Wilson came home early from a meeting to find Viola sitting on the edge of their bed, a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with shock. "Are you okay?" he asked, immediately concerned, rushing to her side. She nodded, then shook her head, then laughed, a sound caught between disbelief and joy. "I'm late," she whispered. Wilson blinked, confused. "For what? Do we have plans?" Viola held up a small white stick with 2 pink lines. "Oh," Wilson breathed. "Oh," Viola echoed. They stared at each other for a long moment, the magnitude of what those 2 pink lines meant settling over them like snow. And then Wilson dropped to his knees in front of her, buried his face in her lap, and laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy mixed with disbelief and awe. "We're having a baby," he breathed against her stomach. Viola's hands moved to his hair, her own tears falling freely now. "We are," she confirmed, her voice shaking. "We're having a baby." Wilson looked up, his eyes shimmering with tears, and Viola saw something in them she'd been waiting months to see. Complete, unguarded, overwhelming love. "You've already changed my life once," he whispered. "I can't believe we get to do this again together." 9 months later, on a snowy December evening while Manhattan transformed into a winter wonderland outside their window, Wilson held their newborn daughter for the first time. She was perfect. A tiny, miracle swirl of brown skin and gray eyes, with curly hair that already defied gravity and a grip strong enough to wrap around his pinky finger and his entire heart simultaneously. "She's so strong," Wilson whispered, unable to take his eyes off her tiny face. "Just like her mama." Viola, exhausted but radiant in her hospital bed, smiled weakly. "She's stubborn like her daddy," she countered. "Look at that frown. She's already judging the world." Wilson laughed, actually laughed, even through his tears. He leaned over carefully, mindfully of Viola's stitches and exhaustion, and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. "For this. For her. For changing everything." Viola looked at the 2 loves of her life, her brilliant, damaged, healing man and their perfect daughter, and felt her heart expand in a way she didn't know was possible. "Forever never looked so beautiful," she whispered. And it didn't. It looked like a curvy, brilliant woman who refused to apologize for taking up space in the world. It looked like a cold man who learned that vulnerability was the truest strength. It looked like a love story that broke every rule and proved that sometimes, the best things happen when you stop trying to control life and start living it. It looked like a family they never saw coming but couldn't imagine existing without. The beach house porch in the Hamptons, 3 years after Wilson first brought Viola there. Golden sunlight streams through the railings, casting long shadows across the weathered wood. The ocean breathes steadily in the distance, in, out, a rhythm as old as time itself. Wilson Taylor sits in a rocking chair, barefoot, wearing faded jeans and a white linen shirt rolled to his elbows. His daughter, Sophia Catherine Taylor, named for wisdom and the grandmother she'd never meet, sits in his lap, her tiny hands wrapped around a picture book. Again, Daddy, she demands, her voice high and imperious in that way only 3-year-olds can manage. Again? Wilson asks, raising an eyebrow. That's the 4th time, baby girl. Again. Sophia insists, her gray eyes, so like his own, flashing with determination. Wilson laughs and starts the story over, because he's learned that some battles aren't worth fighting. That sometimes love means reading the same book 17 times in a row even when you can recite it in your sleep. Viola emerges from the house carrying a tray with lemonade and cookies. Her hair is in a messy bun, she's wearing one of Wilson's old Harvard shirts and denim shorts, and she's never looked more beautiful. You're spoiling her, she says, settling into the chair beside them with a knowing smile. She's my daughter, Wilson replies simply, as if that explains everything. Spoiling her is my job. Sophia looks up at her mother and grins, Viola's smile on Wilson's face. Mama, Daddy read the dragon book 4 times. 4 times? Viola gasps dramatically. That's a new record. They spend the afternoon like that, no phones, no emails, no board meetings or crisis management. Just 3 people who found each other against all odds, learning to be a family one sticky kiss and spilled lemonade at a time. Later, after Sophia has crashed hard from her sugar high and is napping inside, Wilson and Viola stand at the porch railing, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Wilson wraps his arms around Viola's waist from behind, pulling her back against his chest. She leans into him with the ease of long practice, her hands covering his. You know what's funny? Wilson murmurs into her hair. What? I spent 38 years building rules. Convincing myself that control was everything. That if I just followed the formula, calculated every risk, eliminated every variable, I could protect myself from ever being hurt. He pauses, emotion thickening his voice. And then you walked into my office in a lavender dress, breaking every single rule I'd built my life around. And instead of the chaos I'd been taught to fear, you brought me peace. Viola turns in his arms to face him, her eyes soft. You brought yourself peace, she corrects gently. I just gave you permission to try. Wilson shakes his head. No. You gave me more than that. You gave me a reason to be brave. You showed me that the fortress I'd built wasn't protecting me, it was imprisoning me. He cups her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. You taught me that loving someone with your whole heart isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes us human. The only thing worth risking everything for. Tears shimmer in Viola's eyes. Look at you, she whispers. Using words like heart and love and human without flinching. Who are you and what did you do with the Ice King from the glass tower? Wilson laughs, that full, unguarded laugh that had taken Viola months to coax out of him but now came easily. You melted him, he says simply. One smile, one challenge, one moment of patience at a time. They kiss as the sun paints the sky in shades of amber and rose, 2 people who had traveled impossible distances to find each other, who had broken every rule and rebuilt themselves stronger in the process. Behind them, through the screen door, comes the sound of tiny feet running. Mama. Daddy. There's a butterfly. They pull apart, both laughing, and turn to see Sophia pressed against the screen door, her face lit with wonder at the simple magic of an orange monarch that has landed on the porch railing. Come see, she demands. Quick, before it flies away. Wilson scoops his daughter up, hoisting her onto his shoulders so she can get a better look. Viola snaps a photo on her phone, not for Instagram, not for show, just to remember this moment. This perfect, ordinary, extraordinary moment. As the butterfly spreads its wings and lifts off into the golden hour light, Sophia claps her hands and squeals with delight. And Wilson Taylor, former Ice King, reformed control freak, the man who once believed that curves were chaos and emotion was weakness, feels his heart swell with a joy so profound it makes his earlier life seem like a black and white photograph. I love you, he says, looking from his daughter to his wife. Both of you. So much it terrifies me. So much I don't have words for it. Viola slides her arm around his waist, resting her head against his shoulder. Then don't use words, she says softly. Just keep showing up. Keep being brave enough to love us. That's all we need. And as the sun finally touches the horizon, painting the world in liquid gold, Wilson Taylor understands the truth he'd spent most of his life running from. Control was never the answer. Rules were never the solution. The fortress was never protection. Love was the answer. Vulnerability was the strength. And the woman who broke all his rules had saved his life by teaching him how to actually live it. Thank you for staying with Wilson and Viola's journey from beginning to end. Their story reminds us that transformation is possible, that love can reach even the coldest hearts, and that sometimes the rules we build to protect ourselves are the very things keeping us from the happiness we deserve. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment sharing your favorite moment. Hit that like button to support this channel. Subscribe for more emotional love stories that will make you believe in the power of human connection. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to tear down walls and let love in. Remember, you are worthy of a love that breaks your rules and remakes your world. Until next time, keep your hearts open and your faith strong. With love, Whispers of Love.